do you want to just put it there?
Yeah, just...
You're now being recorded, so anything you say could be cancelable.
Could be
anything. Well, anything's possible. Hello, welcome to Spoken Mirrors, which is the Far From Madding Crowd from Linlithgow's Bookshops interview series with authors, writers, charlatans, various in between. And I'm pleased to announce our first guest, Michael Pedersen, is here. Michael, I'll introduce you properly in a minute. First of all, your hair. How is she? Where's she going? What journey is she on? And how's she enjoying lockdown? She seems to have flourished.
Yeah, I mean, of all the things that have came out of lockdown, my hair has fermented. It's been a thickened period for that.
Yep.
I feel a bit at the moment like my head is a plinth for this hirsute mass on top of it. It's been steadily growing away, not dampened by any world or international affairs. So to be surrounded by such brio and spirit has actually been quite encouraging to me in the more, bruising moments of lockdown. But I don't know where this journey ends, if I'm honest, Ian. Started growing it and it's not stopped yet. I've not felt the compulsion to visit a hairdresser's as it's came out in and out of possibilities. So yeah, I mean, I guess when I have my first major accident on account of bumping into something, that might be the warning sign that I'm looking for to take immediate action. But at the moment I've got a bobble, come equipped with a bobble on my wrist in case it gets a bit too tricky. So
is that the man bun ponytail? What's the strategy?
So the strategy is just to scrunch it up and get as tight as possible. And there's a variation of how that goes. I'm new to the process of tying up my hair in that fashion, and I guess initially reluctant for it to look overly trendy.
Yes.
Whilst not trying to look too affectedly disorganised or unkempt either.
Yeah.
So it's a hard balance. I'm working it out step by step.
It's a hard time. It's a hard time.
Yeah.
Well, we'll move away from the serious questions. Michael, you're Edinburgh-based, Glasgow-born poet, playwright, and animateur. Am I pronouncing that right?
So that's the other way around. Glasgow-based, Edinburgh-born.
Oh, you're right. I'm so sorry.
That's all right. I mean, it gets tricky with that sort of cross-cultural colonisation,
Aye.
and I definitely don't have the Morningside Maisie accent, so it can throw people off their stride.
Well, just elaborate on animateur. That's a really interesting term. I don't hear that often.
It is a very interesting term,
Aye.
and I am not taking any culpability for it because when I was drafting my bio, which are notoriously difficult things to do, to toot your own horn whilst trying to seem humble and quirky at the same time, Jerry Cambridge, who was editing my poems at the time, used it to describe me, and maybe when I published a poem in the Dark Horse, or maybe when he was doing an introduction in some variety, and wedged in that term, and it just sort of stuck. It latched itself onto the biography in someone that sort of makes lively, animated happenings and events. And I thought that very pretentiously leans to what we do with Noriki outside the poetry stuff. So Jerry Cambridge coined it. It wedged its way in there, and it's only very recently left, but it's definitely printed on both of those books, so it's still around in some capacity.
And did you meet Jerry at Cove Park, the residency there?
Yes.
2011?
I did.
Yes.
That's very good.
I did do one Google search, yeah.
Yeah. Aye, so that was a weird thing. Before I'd done a residency at Cove Park, they did this experimental thing called Freeing a Poet's Voice. It was with a Scottish voice coach called Kirsten Linklater, who worked out in Hollywood, in LA, in America, But she'd done on her bio, it said she'd worked with people like Bill Murray and Sigourney Weaver and all these sort of big stars. And I guess it was a bit of an experiment to see how she would fare with a group of poets. And I was one of the 10 or so poets that went out there. Jerry Cambridge, Liz Berry, Ross Barber, Polly Clark, big group of people went out there. And Claire Pollard as well. And yeah, we just worked with his voice coach and did sort of chants and yogic things and role play, theatrics, obviously oratorial stuff. And it was a mixing pot for everyone in there. I sort of threw myself behind it. I was just happy to be there at that point in time. I was punching above my weight in that group. And yeah, I met Jerry, and one of the early exercises we would do was these sort of strange stretches and massage techniques. So I met Jerry, sort of met him massaging the small of his back.
Wow.
And then where do you go from there?
That is the most poetic part of the body.
Okay, there we go. Is it?
That's yeah, let's go with that.
I'm feeling like there's not as many poems about the small of the back than there is about the crotch or the nipples or the face. I'm yet to be convinced on that.
Well, I think this bit here, like the soft bridge. I think that's good. That's fine. That doesn't. That's
I guess I've not heard too many people yell out in flames of passion. Touch me on the soft bridge.
On the soft bridge, I mean.
But
architects, engineers, maybe.
We'll see where it goes.
So Cove Park, did any of that inform your first two pamphlets? We should probably start there, which were both with two relatively small publishers,
really small.
Windfall.
Yeah, so no, I don't think it did in any way. It was a very interesting workshop, and yeah, definitely sort of learnt a lot from it. But a lot of the techniques were fun and interesting, got me thinking about different ways of breathing and all of that, meditative processes, but it isn't something that I personally carried through into a live reading environment. My pamphlets, the first time I published a pamphlet, it was 2009, I was like 22, 23, something like that, and it was on Coup Press, small Aberdeen publisher, and I hadn't ever read out loud at that point. I sort of started the opposite way and just was plugging away trying to get publications in magazines or e-zines and then journals, and was sort of writing, crafting, reading a lot and submitting poems to lots of different places. And then I got a few together and then approached Coup Press, or they approached me. I can't really even remember how it came about. I had a couple of their pamphlets, I really liked them and I liked the sound of it, and yeah, we just decided to do a pamphlet together. I then sort of released that. Then I just finished training as a lawyer at the time and moved to Cambodia for a year. And then by the time when I was coming back, we found out I'd been shortlisted for the Callum MacDonald Memorial Award. And I missed that because I was still in Cambodia. But when I come back, I did a sort of staggered launch for it, and read aloud for it for the first time, like long after it had been published. So yeah, and the workshop after that with Cove Park was all on reading aloud, but I was still sort of pretty obsessive about just writing, publishing and printing poetry at that point in time. I wasn't aware of the extent of spoken word.
The performance, yeah. Well, I mean, it was spoken word. I mean, I feel that landscape kind of blossomed in the 2010s, surely. Maybe around that time they were probably nascent. I mean, there were probably figures obviously working active in that scene, but maybe I think of like button poetry or things that exploding in its popularity during the 2010s, so maybe at the time it wasn't.
It's the period of time that I came aware of it, and I guess when you become aware of something, you always feel like that's because it's happening now. That's its nascence, that's its birth, that's it launching, and that's certainly how I felt during sort of 2011, 2012, like that period of time. But of course you can go back and find hundreds of brilliant poets who could be considered experts of spoken word that were already super established in that thing. But it was a consolidating of skills around the topic and a popularisation of the term, which had a really positive impact all throughout poetry. So
100%. Okay, back to the page.
Yeah.
Play With Me, debut collection.
Yeah.
So it reads, well, again, I'm being very assumptive. For me, it reads like I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, Bilgensroman? Is that how you say it? like coming of age, but like the German term.
Yeah.
That feels like that. You know, a lot of evocations of childhood and lots of characters as well, like Manchester John, Riley. I wonder if you could talk a bit about like that. Like, is the reason you kind of latch, but go for those characters, kind of narrate those experiences or memories?
Yeah, I guess I was always very interested in the confessional poetry, like you know, Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath and all of these different writers, but I didn't necessarily want those confessions to come directly from me all of the time. And I guess a lot of the most confessional aspects of writing for me and of life for me have been through these characters. And it's often been not the characters or the friends that I have some of the most special memories with, but those that put me in to states of emotional extremity, or those that brought out a facet of my behaviour that didn't really come out under any other circumstances. So through these characters and these poems, it was my own emotional extremity, but told through their story. And I've always enjoyed character-based writing in the novel, and I've always been pretty elated when I found it well crafted in poetry books. And these characters are people that really I was affected by and was trying to touch on. And so, some of them I would describe as some of the most influential friends I've had in my life, but in a way they're also friends that they're also friends that I can reflect back on with a bit of a objectivity, because they're no longer constant presences in my life. So in that way, the memories I have of them are pretty static. So it's very easy to churn them back up again and to re-examine them from who I am at this point in time, looking back into them, and then it becomes a really interesting story because you're able to put the magnifying glass onto your own life via them as a medium. And yeah, people and their stories have always just really fascinated me. So I just couldn't see writing a poetry collection that didn't have poems named after these people. And then there's also like paeans to poets like Tom Buchan or different people. So it's poets that have influenced me, people that has influenced me. With that first collection, it reads like a debut collection. And I guess as it should. I wasn't an accomplished enough poet at that point in time, or widely read or erudite enough to have put out a timeless collection of poetry, but that was all right. I arrived at this sort of energy full, bursting off the page, everything I want to say just thrown at it first book of poetry, and I think anyone who picks it up that's an experienced poet reader will see immediately that's what it is. Hopefully that's pretty enjoyable, because as well as reading the poems, I could see where I wanted them to go, or where I wanted these stories to continue from. And hopefully that's what happened in that collection. I remember previous to that, way back when I published my first pamphlet, I got this sort of, and I read it out a lot, I got this bad review. It still had gestures of kindness in it, but it was definitely a bad review.
Can you say not who wrote the review, but a name that rhymes with the person that wrote the review? Or is that still too obvious?
I don't know. It was in Sphinx Poetry. There's the Sphinx pamphlet.
The pamphlet.
Thing. So you can just go on there and Google my name. It's there. It's beautifully written. It's really nice, and it sort of said that. It said something that along the lines of, this was a real feast of language and flavours. It had everything from Chateaubriand and prime cut rib to stodgy rice pudding, and unfortunately, generous helpings of cheese. I fear. She was like, I fear Pedersen might look back upon this pamphlet with the embarrassment of an adult reading their childhood diaries.
Can you attest to it?
Oh yeah, that first pamphlet, yeah, definitely, I mean, it makes me squirm. But she was very optimistic and said, with a ruthless edit and some life experience, I feel this could be a Michelin dining experience. And that was the first pamphlet, and I thought, any time that I'm doing writing talks at universities to create writing students, I always read that as a sort of caution to publishing your first chunk of poetry, whether it's in pamphlet form or whatever, too fast, and with too much gusto and not enough editorial control. But at that point in time, Wild Horses couldn't have stopped me back when they offered to publish that pamphlet. It was like the book deal for me. That as like a young 20s guy who wasn't involved in the poetry scene in any way, just thought, I've made it.
Yeah, 100%.
But at the same time, I enjoy. So you can read so many accolades on writers' books from elsewhere, but a nicely worded sort of hold your horses
Critical
style review. It's been really beneficial, and I recount that review obviously more than any other review, because to a certain extent it's still true. I always use that as the I guess as the impetus to take a step back and think, do you really want to publish this? Is it saying something that you need to say? Is it an interesting enough piece of writing? Could it start any later? Could it end any earlier? Is it as taut as it should be? So it's still that sort of prod in the ribs.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, because then that leads quite nicely into my next question, which was there's an interesting poem in play with me called Justice Local. Is that pronounced right?
Called what?
Justice Local.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah.
Exactly, I did it with an inflection, so
Yeah,
it seems
no, it's
more
good.
global.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's French.
Where you sort of talk about essentially the death of a child in a car accident.
Yeah.
And there's definitely a lot of poems where, well, again, assumptive tone here, but like, there's a gregariousness or a playfulness, which then is actually almost a decoy for something a lot more oblique, and definitely pathos, I suppose, is a word for it. So I was wondering how do you sort of manage with that double bind of, needing to discuss, tragedy and violence while not aestheticizing or romanticizing it?
Yeah, I guess it's just hopefully the same methodology that you apply to your life in terms of keeping sane and working through stuff. Some of these tragic, heart-wrenching, really lugubrious experiences happen to you, and you do get caught up in the melancholy of it all, but at the same time you have to remind yourself about everything that you celebrated that took you there, around these people, around it. Why was I in Cambodia? Like all of the interesting things I was doing at that point in time. I did witness this horrible incident of this child getting mowed down, and then this sort of ferocious local justice happening after that, and that's the brutality of it. And that was like an incident in a time that I had to deal with at that point in time. But all around that was this really different, enriching, magical sort of life that I was living, that I want to decorate the poem alongside it, because it's not just about the moment, it's about where I was at that point in time. So it is a hard balance, because you don't want to make light of these incidents, but sometimes you have to give yourself a humour or a buoyancy when you look back upon them in order to help you get through them. So I guess a lot of the time it's just the life stationery that you employ to make these terrible things, torturous incidents that happen, livable and doable at these points in time. And it's just finding little fissures and little inlets into the stories behind them, or the more jovial or jolly reasons and exciting reasons for you being there. So yeah, I think it's just all the life stationery around the big thing, and at the end of the day you've survived this incident, so let's have a glimpse of that throughout. And hopefully it doesn't undermine the ferocity or the brutality of what went on. It just enhances it, and it causes you to celebrate the life that's still there. Yeah.
I mean, because Bolaño has that line at the end of the fourth bar of 2666, like the big tome, where he talks about the dark streets and all that can be heard as laughing, and it's kind of that, like the persistence and almost the need to overcome those obstacles, and even having to overcome those obstacles is a shame. So it's almost like impossible not to in that regard. Well, Oyster, double the length, ostensibly, to play with me. What was, so you've already kind of touched on this, what was like the stylistic shift between the two? You were kind of coming at this maybe a bit more cautious, or maybe
less hurried, I think. Less hurried, and like I wanted to give I mean, it's hard to say that with a book that's maybe double the length of the collection, but I wanted to give more whilst giving less.
No, for sure, yeah.
I guess I'd learned to self-edit a little bit. I'd read a lot more poetry, and I had 4 years to write it. I was in wasn't in quite as much as a hurry to publish it. In fact, it was Polygon that started poking at me, saying, "It's been a while now. Where's your next collection? We know you've published a lot of these poems and stuff." So I think it was that, and it was the need with a lot of the poems that I was sure of them beforehand. Not because with Play With Me, about 75-80% of the content I'd published in magazines and journals, because I wanted this validation poem by poem from other places that it was good enough to be in a collection, to be alongside these other writers in these magazines. But with Oyster, I'd only really published a couple of them outside of the book before it arrived, because I was pretty, content in the way I was writing, in the pace that I was producing, in the self-editorial process, in the judgment I was putting the poems up against to make sure they made it through. So I spent 4 years on it pretty much, and it's double the length of Play With Me, but I maybe had double the amount of poems that actually went into it in the end.
Yeah, textual length doesn't correspond to I don't know, thematic length isn't a term, but we'll go with that. You don't necessarily agree here.
But I was keen to play back to it as well, and I took some of the characters again, like Manchester, John and Lyco, and I wanted to continue their stories, to show how the deepening of the relationship. I like books that call back to their predecessors, but also to maybe exhibit how I developed as a writer as well, alongside these characters and these poems. It's very easy to compare two poems from two collections if they're about the same content or the same person, to take two wildly different and disparate pieces of writing and then try and see how a writer's developed in some perspectives is trickier to do. But with those two characters and the continuation of their story, I felt like it was pretty necessary to have them back into the book, and not purposely either. I guess writing about them in the first instance just sort of lit a fuse with all of the things I had to say about them. But I guess Oyster was a lot more enjoyable because there wasn't that sort of, I wasn't chasing anything. There wasn't that desperation in a lot of those poems, which is an exuberance as well. It's like, very content, but yeah, I just took my time with it to a certain degree, and had so many great opportunities throughout the course of it. By that point I'd been to sort of Japan and America reading poetry. I'd got the Rob Louis Stevenson Award and went to France for a period of time. So I had a lot of live reading opportunities and international poetic experiences to reflect upon that I wanted to sort of lock into there. Also, obviously, Play With Me's illustrated sort of scantily with 3 or 4 illustrations, and I wanted to up that ante and make it a properly illustrated book.
That's good. Yeah, you don't get many poetry books which are illustrated as well, so that's a good multimedia exercise, I suppose.
Yeah, I think so. A lot of those poems are pretty weird visual creatures. They're packed full of all these different metaphors and images, and it's interesting in its own right to just see which images an illustrator would choose, what they see as the ones that are, well, either A, bounding out the poem for them and sort of personify it, or B, easiest and most exciting to draw.
So kind of as a widening the idea of the stylistic shift, who haunts your texts? What writers haunts your texts? Where do you get your influences from? Is probably a more bland way to put it, but you already mentioned the confessional poets, but who else? Armitage gets is it Armitage or Motion that gets a
name check, and it's definitely Armitage. In Play With Me, as I'm sitting in the job centre with my Simon Armitage book. Yeah, big fan of Simon Armitage. I read a lot of poetry. I read poets that are winning prizes. I read poets that I find in magazines that I really like the sound of their collection. And maybe to jump ahead here, but not to get too much into it, I guess I'm influenced by Noriki at the same time, because at that point in time, throughout writing Oyster, we were putting on like a couple of shows a month, not just in Scotland but elsewhere in the UK, and we're putting on different poets stylistically all the time. It might be Douglas Dunn alongside Holly McNish on a lineup, so we're putting on really stylistically, performatively different poets, and I'm reading all these collections and I'm seeing what poems that they choose to read on the night. and I've got myself into a really fortunate position where some of my favourite contemporary poets, in the UK at least, we were able to bill month by month. So my whole sort of social life, my whole work life outside of the poetry element or outside of the writing side of it was all consumed by reading and listening to poetry. So it wasn't, I've read a lot of poets' entire oeuvres, but generally there's no correlation between which poetry collection I'm reading next, apart from the fact that I'm trying to keep an eye on what's exciting at the moment, and what's exciting me and what's exciting other people that I enjoy reading. New publishing houses, when they pop up and they sort of develop an acumen or for putting on new and interesting writers, I'll read everything new that they come out. So I was just completely immersed in poetry, and then you get people like book Kai Miller for the first time in 212, and then I'm sort of blown away by his poetry, and then go back and get all his books. Or so you're actually finding contemporary poets that are pretty established and have got a lot of books out there, but you've not came across them. So you then start mining back the past. And I sort of asked, I was doing a wee broadcast for the Scottish Poetry Library on Poetry Day, interviewing John Hegley, and that was a question that I thought about asking him, not so much just about influences, but whether there was a specific poet that I guess he'd idolised or lionised for a period of time, that over maybe they'd released 10 books over 10 years and you're waiting on them, each new book to come out, and you feel like you've sort of developed alongside their career, and you have this idea of where a poet is in between each collection. And I think that takes, being alive a few more decades than I have, and certainly more than you have, to be able to have followed a poet over his career. But I just think it must be such a different experience to be sort of waiting on the edge of your seat for each of these poets' new collections coming out, and knowing, if it was someone like Ted Hughes, for example, that had a very public life, what he would be dealing with at that point in time, seeing that arise, to discovering a poet, and then at the end of their career, and then being able to just zoosh back through it. I guess it's like your Netflix binge compared to your year by year film. But I just thought it was a very interesting way to discover similar poets, and wondered how that might influence you if you just read all their writing in a flurry. It might just be this big explosion of semi-influenced writing at that point in time, as opposed to something that's constantly there, sort of living life on the meter that you're living life.
Nice. Ink comes up a lot in your work.
Ink,
yeah. Oh. Have you noticed that before?
No.
I guess that's one of those things that's kind of subconscious.
But I love pen and ink drawings, and I love cities by night. So I love city silhouettes of night as if they're drawn out of ink. So I imagine it is something I reflect upon quite a lot. I like things that are inky. I like pen and ink drawings are some of my favourite. Like there's really intricate gossamer thin lines, and city silhouettes and trees turn into the ink at night time. So there we go. There's a trope.
There's a trope. There's a
Unseen.
trope. Yeah, I mean, who's it? Kate Steenhauer in Aberdeen. She does it live. So she's done like these theatre pieces before where she is live ink drawing as Shane Strachan, you might know. He would be reading out his work, which is based off conversations he overheard at like Aberdeen bus stops. And then somebody's playing guitar in the corner, as they always are in contemporary theatre. I
like the live drawing experience. We've had it a couple of times at Nordique. We've had Jenny Soup do it. We've had painters come with full sort of canvases. But there's a guy, Tom Morgan Jones, as well, who does a sort of drawing the experience thing, who's pen and ink style drawing a lot of Norikis, and whereas I guess a lot of artists do it on the iPad these days, Tom still has like the sleeves rolled up and the big ink bottles and the pens out, and it's a camera pointing out the paper as things go on. So I've my penchant for pen and ink drawings is incorporated into the events. But also Shane Strachan. So I was doing a show in Paris with
what was it called? Highland something?
the very French sounding Highlander
yes.
off the side of the Seine in Paris. And we were doing a show in November we were actually sort of talking to Shakespeare and Co about doing something with them, and we couldn't get the date to fit, but we thought, you know what, let's just do it anyway. Holly's book had just been translated into French publishing house, so she was over doing some press for that at the time. And I've got the same agent as Holly and Kay and stuff, so she was like, yeah, let's do it, let's make a wee trip out of it. And then another one of Becky's writers, Gemma Kearney, who's done a couple of books, one for Canongate and elsewhere. She's also a big Radio 1 presenter as well as an author, came over to do a reading with us. And then we set up the reading, it was in the sort of cellar of this Highlander pub, which was actually, you know, pretty rustic, pretty charming. It wasn't like the feared Irish pub abroad style.
Okay,
It was actually pretty beautiful, and it was in fact a French literary journalist from Le Monde that recommended it to me. She says, I know this sounds like a sort of slapdash place, but it's very good for shows. It's got an underground cave, you can get like 75, 80 people in there, little microphone, packet full, and it's pretty fun. It reminded me of the vaults underneath Edinburgh at that point in time. But while we were doing the show, I guess a couple of weeks before it, I remembered that it was November and there was going to be someone doing the Robert Louis Stevenson Fellowship residency. So I then said to the book trust, here, we're doing the show, it's sold out, it's going to be quite a lot of interesting people there. I loved doing that residency so much, and I had looked for any excuse to go to Paris. So whoever's in residency, if they wanted to come and read something, we could do a sort of 10-minute slot for them. And it was Shane, and he came, and it was brilliant. Yeah. And it was really interesting twist to the show.
Absolutely, yeah. No, he's one of the most exciting in Aberdeen, and probably one of the most prominent voices from that whole bubble at the moment, I'd say. I hope you're watching, Shane. What do I have next? I think.
I know. Aberdeen must be in a hangover here, and you've left it. Re-analogue started there.
My one, the one and only artist working in Aberdeen has left, and now it's bereft. For context, I was in Aberdeen for 4 years, and I did a bunch of stuff there. I mean, it's interesting because, any kind of spoken word is now dead because of the pandemic.
Yeah.
Well, not dead. Okay, dead is very strong.
Live events.
Well, yes. I mean, there are online alternatives. Hysteria is probably the best in Aberdeen, which is a women's and non-binary night, because their focus is always community. And like that social dimension was always, I think that's always what's most important in an open mic. Right? Well, versus something, if you're looking for some kind of aesthetic quality or clarity or whatever, then that's probably when you would go for curation, which is what Re-Analog, my collective, did. But yeah, so I mean, it'll be a complete and utter reset whenever I go back, because I mean, lockdown, who knows what kind of live events will occur. But so that's an interesting place to look at as well. I mean, like, a lot of the Re-Analog people have gone to do great things. Matt Gibb is signed to Lost Map Records.
Nice.
I'm trying to think. Well, he's the main success so far, but then there's me as well. And then I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting exodus to Glasgow as well for people my age. Yeah. Of Aberdeen to Glasgow, that kind of pipeline, if there is such a thing.
Yeah. Well, I remember very fondly coming up to do your first Re-Analog.
You did, yeah.
And then it was the Beast from the East. It just started revving its engine at that point. So we got up there and then we left, and it started to clamp down on the motorway when we were coming back, and we took an earlier turn off, and I ended up, because I was going to get dropped off in Glasgow, but we ended up going to Edinburgh. And then we found out that if we hadn't taken that turn off and had tried to take the Glasgow one, over the next hour the snow came firing in, and that piece of motorway got clogged up and people were in their cars overnight and everything like that. So we narrowly escaped it on the way back, which is pretty handy.
Well, extreme weather events have always followed every Re-Analog event, which probably shows it was a cursed enterprise from the start. But
or charmed.
Well, yeah, looked upon by somebody. But yeah, I know, that's strange.
But it was a great vibe. You'd put together a really good night.
Too kind. Yeah, but
full,
we got
engaging.
Full just like the snow.
Lots of different stylistic performances. It was a well curated launch event.
Thank you. Well, Noiriki was the influence. Not to circle jerk too much. Do you want more wine?
Sure.
Will I edit this out?
I don't know. I don't
know. Maybe we should keep it in.
Confident adults,
Maybe
I think we can have a glass of wine.
We'll zoom in and post.
In fact, it's almost it's not expected. It's cliched. line during a literary discussion.
I know, but it's ironic, so it's okay.
Nice.
Which is the way. What have I got next? Do you write for performance or page? Is that distinction arbitrary?
I think we sort of covered that, it's like write first and then, but a lot of the poems that are in the book, even if I read them out loud, I sometimes make, often unbeknown to me, adjustments to them in the way that I read them out loud. I noticed, so the book, even the poem Oyster there, which I read quite a lot, the title poem of the book, I noticed Holly McNish does these like regular Instagram gigs online during lockdown, and she's read Oyster a few times, and I've heard her read it, and then I thought, well, she's reading that bit wrong, and then she's not. She's actually reading it right. She's reading the version of it that's printed in the book that I've sort of slaved over and edited over, but I read it wrong. I read an adjustment or a different version of it, and I think with nearly all of the poems I read out loud, there's small tweaks or alterations, tiny things which I guess only I would notice, or some obsessive. But yeah, so it can exist in those two formats, even as a singular piece. But the writing for me always comes first. I never think about where it goes afterwards. Always trying to write. Yeah,
that's probably where I think as well in terms of work. I know there's an interesting assumption that is like, I don't know why I'm looking up into the sky. Like complexity is some kind of like, complexity is not necessarily always elitist. Yeah. I feel like people like to say work that isn't particularly great, and then they kind of defend it as being accessible or raw. Yeah. But then when I think of like, and then usually the argument is that this means it can reach more people than just people that usually wouldn't be reactive for literature. But I mean, if I think of people from, kind of marginalised group like working class writers like Alistair Gray or James Kelman or Frank Kupner, like those are complex people. Yeah. I feel like it should be more, complexity is democratised to everyone, and people should be allowed to write and reach for that kind of like abstract level. I don't know.
Absolutely. At the same time as great poetry can and should be accessible. Edwin Morgan is an accessible poet in the best possible way.
Yeah, they're not opposing.
Yeah, it's when there's this hostility between accessibility and well expressed intricacy that it gets a bit befuddling. But no, they're definitely two pair of lungs, the three of them operating together. And I guess you learn loads from both the intricate poets and accessible poets alongside, and you can see strong writers writing in both those frameworks. It's all just a big glassy lagoon.
Beautiful glassy lagoon. Yeah, I got John Ashbery's selected poems, the best slam poet of them all. So that'll be an interesting brain befuddling moment as well. One more question. So you've got upcoming work, everything from, well, obviously can't say, or we could say, but then we get sued. But you've written now, or screenplay work, you've done play work as well, we haven't touched on yet, and also basically non-poetry. So basically I want to wonder, like, is there a difference between working on those projects to poetry? Is there different methods, different outcomes, different values? I
think so. I just sort of read voraciously what I'm doing at that point in time. Like during lockdown, I have been writing poems. I've been really fortunate to be a member of a little online poetry group that meets every few weeks. So it's kept me writing poems at a time I might not have been doing so. I've been mainly working on prose at the moment, sort of non-fiction stuff, lots of sort of writing about friendship, and that's for a publisher, and that's sort of quite advanced stages. But as that gets to the more, I guess, forensic editorial stages, I've been writing loads of new short stories just because I've been reading short stories. I've been reading the Penguin book of Japanese short stories at the moment, introduced by Murakami and really and interestingly translated. I read like Brian Washington's Lot. Really good short stories at the moment. Just been reading loads of Miranda July's short stories. So when I'm trying to write a particular format, I just read as much of it as possible. But yeah, I've been doing some script writing at the moment with a guy called Robert McKillop. He did like Guilt, the BBC drama, and Clique, and a lot of TV dramas. So working with him, he's been sending me filmic references of scenes to watch and little bits of script to read. So whenever I'm doing that writing, I'll try, if I know I'm going to do a bit of that the next day, I'll read a chunk of script, I'll try and watch something which has been like, I have, you know, lots of accolades and plaudits for the script writing behind it, and just try and immerse myself in that writing. And I guess the big jump for me is that I write poetically. It's my sort of visceral go-to, is this quite poetic, quite descriptive, love of language, sort of flourishing through version of writing. So when I take that over into script writing or story writing, I try and read writers that are well renowned to be like super laconic, on the ball, no spare adjectives going anywhere. It's like a sort of literary, you know, spear. There's no meat on it at all. It's made to glide through the sky. So I try and read writers that are doing the craft successfully that I'm doing. But yeah, at the moment, I guess I've pretty much been doing fiction, non-fiction, and script writing. I've maybe written like 6 poems this year.
Wow,
but I've written tens of thousands of words of the other stuff.
Unprecedented? Is that a completely different shift to how you've worked in the past?
It's the least that I've written poetry, least amount of, smallest profusion of poems that I've produced over a period of time. But on the flip side of that, it's perhaps the most productive and prolific I've been in terms of writing at that point in time. And it's just, as someone that will be, I guess, doing my first ever script, properly script along this side. I've done some wee ones for the 5-minute theatre, for National Theatre and stuff like that, but this will be my first big bit of script and first big bit of non-fiction writing. I just completely throw myself at the mercy of all the great writers within those fields, and try and read and think and listen to podcasts, and just completely get swallowed up in that form of writing, as I do when I'm writing poetry at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I've always enjoyed with screenplays is that it does feel like the expansiveness of prose mixed with the quickness that you would only get in poetry.
Yeah.
That's kind of how I feel about it, at least.
Yeah, me too. And that's the thing. These are different genres of writing, but I think my version of writing within them would definitely be described as poetic. In fact, I've had a lot of editorial comments saying, this would work splendidly as a poem in terms of the prose, let's read it out. And then we find a compromise that still has a nice prosody to it, and still is like a very descriptive, poetic piece of writing, but isn't written for a poem. So it's sort of ironing out some of those kinks. But the great part is that if a piece of writing gets booted out for being too poetic and too poem-like, then I've banked it, because it is probably something that I was trying to write as a poem and compromise it into prose. So I've got a big thing. I've got 2 documents. I've got one called Stuff That Could Come Back In, which is me sort of reluctant to say stuff that's went out. And then I've just got one called The Refuge Pile, and it's all the other stuff. And some of my best poems that I've written recently have came out of this refuge pile, because they've just not fitted for something else, because I guess I was trying to write a poem into a sentence structure that it didn't fit into. So juggling between them all is brilliant. I guess it's just like, it's a reflection of the way I'm reading, and that's the way I'm writing at the moment. So it's pretty good.
Nice. Pretty good. It's a good place to end, I feel. I think that's good. It's optimistic. It's uplifting.
It's optimistic, but it's not too haughty.
Aye.
It's managing expectations.
We're not assuming as much. Michael, thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, great.